Hi, and after finally getting into Raid the Emerald Nightmare on normal and heroic difficulty at least, I thought I'd give my thoughts on the raid here. I'll be covering general layout, the environmental feel, the design of boss mechanics. Hopefully it goes without saying that all that's contained here on in is my personal opinion, which may of course differ from other people who have raided the Emerald Nightmare. In terms of layout, it wouldn't work with raids in general, but it's really effective in this raid instance. After the first boss, you have portals to the next 4, which can be done in any order. This allows you to pick on the single target ones consecutively, for example, to potentially save on talent change tomes, or to take account of what you have in your roster on that particular night. You still have to complete all of them in order to get to scenarios, but it's a better system than in Heimel in my opinion, because although there you could determine the order of certain bosses, that was because several of them were entirely optional. Of course, there's a jump forward mechanic which began in Blackrock Foundry here with a quest that you pick up. You just need to kill Scenarios 4 times on a particular mode to be able to port directly to the final boss, which will be of use to those wanting to farm Xavius after progress if they've no interest in the other bosses. That being said, it still appears you need to kill the first boss to be able to get to Malfurion, who is the guy who seems to be able to advance you ahead. There is, in my opinion, the perfect amount of trash. It lasts just long enough for the Master Looter to distribute gear, if you're doing it in a large guild group size of say 30, without feeling like it goes on forever. Assuming you don't pull extra packs, of course. Oh fuck. I may have jumped into something.
Oh, I love you all.
The difference between normal and heroic seems good enough that people who will progress normal first and then go into heroic won't just be met with more of the same. There aren't huge differences, but just enough that you'll have to rethink tactics on some of the heroic versions. The difference is that normal may be easily pugged, which I think is a deliberate level of difficulty. Since LFR was introduced in late Cataclysm, I think the game has moved on more towards casual players preferring to get their raid fix from pug normal groups from the Group Finder tool, with heroics for those who want to push it further after a few weeks. Heroic, on the other hand, is a more significant test, which will allow for real progression to take place for non-mythic raiding guilds. In terms of the environment, from an artistic point of view, it's simply stunning. The look and feel to the place is remarkable, and hazy images of what lies beyond each portal is a nice touch. I especially love the Scenarios area. You have to just stand there looking at the horizon and then move your camera upwards towards the zenith. There are details that are easily missed but well worth taking in. I'm less keen on the desolation of the area with Xavius, but of course within the context of the raid and its narrative, it totally works, so it's not a criticism as such. In terms of the bosses, Nathendra is a generally nicely designed boss, along with all the others. I do have a couple of minor gripes, however. It's the first boss in a very real sense, as you cannot access the part of the raid where you choose your order until after this one. As such, it's unfortunate that it's not the easiest. I would say that, on normal and heroic at least, in my opinion, Ursok, the Dragons of Nightmare and Il'gynoth are all easier bosses. This means that for progress purposes, you can slog your guts out on the first boss and maybe even get a bit frustrated and then almost sail through the next much more easily. This can be both disheartening at first and takes away some of the sense of progressive accomplishment immediately after that first boss. Another aspect is the melee-hating nature of the boss. Part of the encounter involves the boss falling down in a weakened state and various insects and maggots suddenly grow into massive proportions before exploding and doing a lot of damage to anyone in range. The issues can be that they are potentially concealed under the wings, tail or other parts of the boss, and so present a greater danger for melee who cannot easily stand in clear space. That being said, the fight is well designed. My chief criterion for a well designed fight tends to include the ability to see different ways of dealing with mechanics, and that is certainly true here. Where tactics seem rather too obvious, then the fight loses much of its interest for me. After Nathendra, you are presented with portals to different parts of Azeroth. I could do the next 4 bosses in any order, but I'll start with what I've made the first boss myself, Ursok. The Ursok fight, on normal and heroic at least, is pretty straightforward in terms of what everyone needs to do. It's essentially a DPS check. This would have made it ideal as a first boss for me personally. The main consideration with this fight is making sure you alternate the charges properly, because taking 2 in a row will one-shot you, and moving the boss only when needed and only as much as is needed to avoid running out of room before you've killed the boss. The Dragons of Nightmare are a bit of a blast from the past. These were initially introduced as world bosses halfway through vanilla, which periodically spawn from the portals you can see around the world in Duskwood, Feralus, the Hinterlands and Ashenvale still today. This is not the most original fight, but it is an enjoyable one. It covers a number of classic themes, such as move out of bad while dealing with adds, and also dealing with different mechanics in an order determined by what seems to be a random order of dragons spawning in, although that random order seems to be at least fixed on a weekly basis. The first time I came across this idea was for the first phase of the original Nefarian fight, but puts me much more in mind of the Spirit King's encounter in Mogashan Vaults, which initially had a random order but was then changed to be static. Il'gynoth is a two-phase fight which alternates between a pure add phase followed by a pure boss DPS phase. The add phase essentially consists of dragging blobs to a location before killing them because their death explosion grants access to another location where you advance the encounter. Sound familiar? That's because it's the Spine of Deathwing again. I'm generally not going to be a huge fan of anything that reminds me of the arse end of that raid tier, but I actually quite like Il'gynoth really. In any add phase there's always a priority at work, but in the case here you can have different DPS players having different priorities, which is good. There are interrupts and having to move targeted effects away from the raid to deal with, as well as avoiding the explosions from the dying blobs that you're padding on, which will only become all the more important when Mythic rolls around. There's also some minor interest during the boss phase, unless you can finish it off in one attempt, in seeing who doesn't make it out in time when they try and get that one extra cast off rather than run away. You might even find yourself in the position where the boss is on very low health and about the time you need to get out. Do you go ham and hope for the best, or do you just put up with another add phase? Decisions. Alaritha Renfall will from here on in be known as the Spider Boss. Can never remember this name. It actually has two forms, as it turns into a bird later, but for most of the fight it seems to be in spider form, if we measure by duration. There are quite a few things to coordinate here, where people drop their green shit, where people go with tornadoes, how exactly you deal with the tether, who takes the feathers in rock form, etc. There's also the individual responsibility, which includes not disturbing egg sacs, especially on the way across to the next platform, and placing your green shit in as small a space as possible. Dragging it across in a straight line might be easier for you, but doesn't help the people who have to follow and put it in the same place. You also get that nice period of chaos at the end of the fight, where there's crap everywhere and almost nowhere safe to stand. All in all, I've made it sound like the most interesting fight so far, and yet I don't actually enjoy it. Hard to say why not, but for me this is the least enjoyable in the raid. But that's just my opinion, and one that I can't even really justify. Once you've done all the portal bosses, it's time to move on to a linear track once again with Cenarius. This fight has some real choice of tactics, and I suspect will be a classic case of some guilds trying to mimic the tactics of another and doing badly from it, because raid composition should probably inform your choices here. There are periods of time when you can attack Cenarius, and then he gets a debuff, which means you need to stop attacking him or take loads of damage yourself. At this time, 3 adds will appear from the following 4 available types. A group of wisps, alright, that's not one add but a group. Dragon, Triant or Dryad. It's not random, and on some waves you get duplicates of the same add type. You only have to deal with 2 of the 3, however, as Malfurion will cleanse one of your choosing. The main sticking points for us before the fight became a lot simpler were deciding which adds to cleanse, and also in realising that there were times when we'd just have to get high stacks of our debuff without being able to cleanse it off. Once the various forms of cleansing were decided upon, the boss went over relatively easily. This was a fight with plenty of variation in possible strategy and good variation throughout the fight. It's a very enjoyable fight with plenty going on at any one time. Finally we get to Xavius himself. He seems to have been to the gym a bit since we last saw him in Darkheart Thicket. Following on from Cenarius, this fight was a little disappointing given that I didn't really notice much difference from normal. Essentially you just had to treat the mechanics with a little more respect. It's not that it's a bad fight, I had much that I enjoy in a raid encounter, but just wasn't much of a progression compared to normal. I can see guilds who need time to progress heroic getting past Cenarius after the expected amount of trouble from a late boss, only to get through Xavius disappointingly quickly afterwards. So all in all, I personally think the Emerald Nightmare is a really enjoyable raid and does well in almost all aspects of the design, on normal and heroic at least. We'll see soon enough how the mythics shape up. If you've been running Emerald Nightmare, whether in a guild or a pug, then share your experiences in the comments below, and I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share, and I'll be doing a more complete review of Legion in general after the first month in the next week or so. Until then, I'll see you later.